And I just spent the whole weekend reading his book, which I highly recommend. It's really, it reads like a detective story. It's not at all like a wonky planning book. But I want to tell you who he is. I have it here somewhere. I found Professor Storper when I was when SB 50 just hit, and it was in the news, and everyone was wondering what the heck was happening. So I called UCLA Planning, and I said, surely there must be someone there who has a different perspective than yours, which is supportive of SB 50. And they said, go talk to Michael Storper. So that was the way I met him, and this has all just happened very quickly, and the fact that he's accepted our invitation we're very grateful. Michael Storper is an economic and urban geographer. He lives in LA, teaches here at UCLA, and also in Paris. In 2014, he was named by Thomson Reuters as one of the, quote, world's most influential scientific minds of the 21st century, for his writings being among the top 1% most cited in the field of social sciences. He's a fellow of the British Academy, and in 2016 received the Founders Medal from the Royal Geographical Society. And his latest book is The Rise and Fall of Urban Economies, Lessons from San Francisco and Los Angeles. It's really, really, really interesting and also very sad to see what's become of our city. And for me, it reverberates in terms of how I see the leadership in Santa Monica and how they are governing currently. So while SB 50 is on hold until next year, the debate is sparking is continuing. And we can lead into that. I would simply say, take it away, and then we'll have time for questions.
All right. Thank you for having me, and it's an honor to be here. So we're discussing sort of what I should do here, and I think there's, I gave a talk in San Francisco the other day that is relatively long. And one idea is that I could try and run through the major points from that talk if you'd like, and if you have the patience to sit through it, and then we can open it up to a debate. I don't know how much that. Otherwise, we can go into something more informal immediately. But
well, I think it was only about an hour.
I think I could do it in less than an hour, certainly. But
this is a very educated, interested crowd.
So let me sort of back up and say where I am, what I think my job is in this debate. Like Tricia said, I'm an economic geographer, and that basically means that I try to deal with the economy in spaces like cities and regions and countries. That has that economic activities and people get distributed into places, and as economies change, so does the location of cities, people, wealth, and so on. And that was the story I was telling about LA and San Francisco from the 70s onward, is that they reversed places, one of them becoming more dynamic than another. And the way I got into the housing debate, it's not actually been a big specialty of mine, but with a colleague that I work with in London, we wrote a paper which reviewed some of the current thinking in economics about housing and how it relates to cities and regions. And so we wrote this paper, not with SB 50 particularly in mind, and then the paper got reviewed and written up in the internet. And when it came out that way, it generated a certain amount of attention, but it also attracted a response from my own colleagues in my department who have a different opinion from me. And that's very frequently the case among academics, and it's perfectly healthy, good thing, right? And I say that because housing and cities are as complex as climate change or medical care or technology or labor markets or anything. They're these giant ecosystems with feedback effects. So it's totally legitimate to have different opinions and to try and think your way through very complex claims and counterclaims. So what I want to try to do tonight is give you my perspective on why I think what SB 50 is based on is not, it's not for me a convincing reading of the evidence, all right? So in a way, I'm giving myself an out because I don't actually have magical solutions to the housing problem. What I have, I think, is a critique that this proposal out here is potentially deeply flawed. So I kind of want to put it back in its place and say, I don't think this one is the right one. And then we can talk about what might be the right way to go. All right, so that's playing an academic and being very cautious, but that's what I'm trained to do. So let me start out though with an inspiring moment from my own life, who was one of my professors. So one of my professors, when I did my doctorate at Berkeley, was a man named Peter Hall, who was British and subsequently became Sir Peter Hall, and was one of really the greatest urban thinkers of the 20th century. He's passed now, unfortunately, a few years ago. But Peter wrote a book that is famous in my world of urban planning, and the title of this book is Great Planning Disasters. Okay? So what is that book about? What he does is he looks at great or big ideas about cities from the past. And what he does is he says, how could these big ideas have been so wrong? So he shows that these big ideas of the past were what they were. They were promoted by the best minds of the day, the smartest people, the most authoritative research was mobilized to promote certain kinds of ideas. So what kinds of ideas are we thinking about? Think about urban renewal, slum clearance, and housing projects in the 1960s. Getting rid of, supposedly desegregating by busing children around cities, building freeways through cities, promoting suburbs in the 1950s. You could go on and on and on, but in all of these cases, what happened is we were promised utopias and we got disasters. So how did we get disasters? And that's what Peter Hall's book is about. He says that essentially you had all of these very smart people, like, you know, professors and experts, and we have pieces of the puzzle. This happens in my research all the time. I take a little issue, I pull it out from reality, I try to look at how A relates to B, but I pull them out of the context of C, D, E, F, G, H, etc. I pull them out because as a scientist, I have to look at something simple to zero in on a result. So then the problem is, when I take that A to B and try to put it back in the wider context, do I know how they relate to each other into a bigger story? And that's what Peter Hall shows, is it sounded good to build housing projects to clear poor people's neighborhoods and build housing projects of towers and gardens. And everybody thought it was a great idea and was a win-win. Nobody understood that it would lead to worse ghettos than the ones that we cleared. All right? And that's kind of the line of thinking is the one that I want to develop with you here today, which is you have a bunch of experts, a lot of the pieces of their ideas look good, but if they're not put together into a big story that works, you can get the famous law of unintended consequences, or as we might say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And this is a lot of what we face in thinking about how to make cities change over time, is it's really hard to get it right. All right, so that's kind of an opening shot. So what I want to do is review to you what is the story that they're telling behind SB 50. Okay, what is their, you might call it a narrative or a master narrative. So why do the people who are promoting SB 50, why do they think it's going to be so good? So this is actually an important part of, I think, any sort of exercise in thinking about how you think about something is to try and get into someone else's shoes or skin and say, what's the story they're telling? You need to know what it is in order to think about what might be wrong about it or right about it. So here's how I see it. Here's what they're saying. They say there's a crisis of housing affordability in our metropolitan areas. They say construction costs are high and that income inequality and hence inequality in people's ability to pay for housing is higher than it used to be. That zoning and regulation are outdated and cumbersome, that we have inadequate affordability policies, and that we live in a society with ongoing discrimination and segregation along not only racial lines, but most especially among economic lines, and that there are all kinds of policies that prevent us, therefore, from addressing this crisis. Okay, so now, their basic story then goes, why do we have that crisis? Demand, as they say, has increased more than supply in many metropolitan areas. And zoning and regulation are responsible for not building enough housing to meet the increase in population. They argue that zoning and regulation is a policy and is what they call captured by neighborhood groups, especially single-family homeowners, who they label NIMBYs. NIMBY means not in my backyard. I'm sure we've all heard this term, right? They argue that because NIMBYs don't want to contribute to changing the city in a forward-moving way and addressing the housing needs of the people who are coming, that we can't allow them to have community control anymore, and we have to override them. And once we do that, they argue, then we'll get a construction boom, and it'll meet this pent-up demand. And they further argue, so it's a complex argument, by the way, and academic, they mobilize a lot of academic thought in constructing it. Second chapter in their story, that was chapter 1. Chapter 2, the new housing that will be built will allow older housing to have higher rates of vacancy and make the older housing cheaper. That will in turn allow other groups who are suffering to move up into that older housing. In the academic literature, that's called filtering. So there's thousands of academic papers that measure filtering, okay? And then they say, as the new housing gets older, it will also then filter down. As long as we keep building more new housing, for the high income people to move into, there's always another group that moves in. So you might think about it metaphorically this way. It's like musical chairs in reverse, right? Musical chairs, right? What happens is you withdraw a chair with every round so that there's always someone excluded, right? Until no more chairs. But in reverse musical chairs, you might think about it as adding chairs in the beginning so that with each round, someone has gone higher up and gotten seated in the previous round, so you're going to always seat more people. That's the filtering argument in the academic literature. So that's chapter 2. Now, it's not over, right? This is a really long book they've written. Okay, so then chapter 3 goes like this. It comes from urban planners, not economists. Okay, it takes the economist's idea of filtering and puts it into a kind of idyllic new urbanism. Here, we are offered the vision of denser, mixed-use, mixed-income communities, less car use, vibrant streets, parklets, bicycling, alternative mobility, not contributing to climate change, and so on and so forth. You've probably all heard that story around. Some planners add in TOD, or transit-oriented development, where the idea is, if you live near a transit line, that you're going to take it. Or that mixed-use developments will allow jobs to be hosted in those developments, and that other people will transit in from other places to get to those jobs located near transit. And all of this, of course, is wrapped into a sort of a packaging, which is that suburbs are homogeneous and boring and old-fashioned, and that we should get rid of them. And so it's kind of where the economics of zoning meet a new vision of city building. All right? You all with me still on the chapters? All right. But now let's think about that story that I just told you. It has a really strong emotional pull when it's stated in that way. There's this very powerful emotional pull on both vast segments of academia, my world, and out there, we might say, in political life. Why? Because it sort of miraculously brings together a whole bunch of things that people find attractive these days. So, high-skilled, high-income millennials will get new housing, and they will do it by building the housing in the neighborhoods where older, whiter, selfish, single-family homeowners live. That is the political narrative, right? Not only that, but here's where that story becomes really, I think, interesting and ingenious. But they say that not only that, but when we do that, we're gonna help the less fortunate, because the filtering or trickle down to the less fortunate will be powerful. So you can see it as a story. If you think of it like like a Hollywood movie with the protagonists, the good people and the bad people, the good people are young millennials with high incomes, developers that build housing for them, right? Poorer people who filter up, and the bad people are neighborhood groups, older, whiter neighborhood groups, and especially single-family homes, right? So it's a world where young, high income, and poor are now on the same, said to be, or they claim they're on the same side, and density is equated to more transit-oriented and more climate-friendly and to less commuting, so the environment wins. And in the romantic imagery, we're now in sociable urban communities and not in isolated, boring suburbs. So I think what's interesting about the housing debate is it's like a giant story about our society today. A whole bunch of things are mixed into this drama about housing legislation. Who would have thought? I mean, a few years ago, I thought housing was really boring as a field, and nothing could be like more boring than working on real estate economics. But it turns out that it's like the whole sort of vision of how we see ourselves is caught up in this. And then, of course, let's get the final chapter of the story, which is if you believe in that narrative, then you come to a solution, a political program. And that is that we have waited long enough to make the big change. And that the only way to get it is by going to the top, in this case, Sacramento, okay? And that's because in the good guys, bad guys, or good women, bad women narrative, right? The bad people are the communities, and notably, the neighborhood groups and homeowners, right? They won't do it. They're holding back the whole society from this progressive vision of win-win, so we are gonna break them. And we'll break them through legislation that simply overrides them, right? And that is radical changes in the zoning code that would allow these higher densities, whether people want it or not, okay? So I call that zoning shock therapy. All right, and you can make fun of it, but I actually think it's what they're proposing. So now, that's the narrative, and I think it's actually really important to understand what kind of discussion we're going into, right? And to think about those claims, because that is the debate that's going on in the media, it's going on in Sacramento, and it's a pretty complicated set of claims and pretty powerful ones. So, okay, now, I want you just to keep that in mind, but I want to actually back away from it for a second and talk about how people in my field see changes in cities, okay? And this is, I think, important because when I came to the housing debate, I realized that a lot of academics were talking about housing, but they weren't referring to the large-scale processes of changes in cities that I was seeing as an economic geographer. And I call these the tectonic forces that are reshaping our cities. And let me tell you about them for a minute, okay? So we're gonna back away because it'll enable us to reframe this debate. So first of all, we've been undergoing a super strong economic change in general since about 1980, and then accelerating after the year 2000. And the change is basically what we in academia call the third industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution was in 1830, and it was when England industrialized around textiles and those kind of things. The second industrial revolution was in roughly 1880 to 1920, and it's when you got all the wonders of modern life, like electricity, communications, meaning radio and television. You got petroleum-based machines and electrical-based machines. You got airplanes, and that's what we call the second industrial revolution. The third industrial revolution is information technology, globalization, and finance, and the global transportation revolution that starts roughly it hits around 1980. It really starts around 1970 in Silicon Valley. But here's the point about this revolution. It changes everything in our economy, everything, okay? And that's why we are roiled by such debates today, is they all really are the consequences of this revolution we've been going through. And the core of the revolution is this. It's the winners and the losers from this revolution, okay? So in this revolution, the demand for skills, for people with skills, requiring a college education, increases and increases and increases relative to the supply of them. On the other hand, demand for skills that don't require a college education, they decline relative to the number of people who have less than a college education, okay? And why is that? Technology is replacing people, and a lot of those jobs are moving offshore as part of the globalization revolution. Why I'm saying, you might say, well, why is he talking about this in relationship to housing? So let's get a little closer. What that revolution has done and continues to do is to augment the inequalities in our society. In every advanced industrial society. What you can measure it a lot of different ways, but basically the shares of income, of total income in the society going respectively to the top 1%, 5%, 10%, and 30% have risen, and the share of income going to the bottom 70% has declined. Okay? I'm not happy to bring this kind of news to anyone, but it's in your face as an academic with every statistical set you analyze. Okay? And I want to put this in perspective. In America, 30% of people have college degrees. Funny about that. And 70% of people do not have a college education. Now, that is shocking probably in Santa Monica, right? It's shocking to me in the world that I live in, which is a world of highly educated people, but it's the reality of our society. And it roughly, the 70-30 division corresponds to the relative winners and relative losers in income in our society, between what are called the skilled and the less skilled, okay? So, now this one more step in this. There's also, so that's the inequalities of the society generally, but they have a distinctive geographical or urban expression. Starting in 1980, we witnessed what we call the Great Inversion, or that means the return to metropolitan areas of the skilled people and the return to the inner part of metropolitan areas of the skilled people. So let me remind people that in the great middle of the 20th century, it was the opposite. What happened from the 1940s through roughly the 1970s is that high-income people left cities. They went to suburbs, and then at a later stage, they actually left a lot of our biggest and most prosperous metropolitan areas and went to other metropolitan areas, notably in the South and the West. And we had an urban crisis back then. There were lots of big cities like New York, even New York, you couldn't pay developers to want to build in Manhattan in the 1970s or 1980s. There was no demand, okay? The LA didn't, its downtown was emptied out and basically defunct. Vast parts of our metropolitan areas were actually pretty cheap relative to income. But that reverses with the third industrial revolution. It reverses because the high income or high skilled jobs of the third industrial revolution are urbanized. They're not suburbanized and they're not small town jobs. The jobs in manufacturing in those days, they had gone to the suburbs or they'd gone to the south. The third industrial revolution brings the best jobs back to the core of metropolitan areas, like here in California, the Bay Area and LA, but to old cold cities like Boston, New York, and Washington, which were a mess in the 1970s, bleeding jobs and bleeding people. So what happens is that in this third industrial revolution, you get something like a double whammy. You get a group of people that gets the income, and they want to go back to big cities. And they want to go into the inner part of big cities where the jobs are, because the jobs are highly clustered. Now, there's another thing that happens that's even more extreme than that. So think about it this way. There are a relatively lot of those educated people in certain metropolitan areas now. Like, we're actually at the lower end of this. That's what I show in my book. But if you go to places like the Bay Area or Washington or New York or Boston, you have a higher than national percentage of the skilled. Like you have 45, 47% people with college degrees in the most skilled metropolitan areas. Orange County has a higher proportion than LA County. On average, LA is a laggard, right? That's our problem. But we're still in that upper tier of cities. We have a lot of skilled people who want to come in here. That's the important thing. Moreover, here's a kind of an astonishing finding. If I'm getting too wonky, just, tell me to stop.
Wonk away.
This is what my job, I love this stuff, but I'm a biased party. Okay, so do it like a thought experiment. In 1970, if you were a person with a college education and you could clone yourself, so take one of you and you put yourself in, Phoenix, and then you put the other one of you in New York or San Francisco or LA. In those days, your two clones, who were the same person with the same skills, they would have quite similar wages between those two places. Maybe a maximum 5% difference. Now in 2019, you're a skilled person with a college or a graduate degree. You clone yourself. You put one of yourself in Phoenix and the other one here in LA. The difference will be on the order of 25% or more.
Wow.
So it's not just the number of skilled people we have, it's that the third industrial revolution makes it a bigger payoff for a higher skilled person to locate in these cities where there are a lot of other skilled people. And that wasn't the case in the past. So it's the number of skilled and what we also call the urban wage premium that have both grown. So that's it's like a two-punch on the presence of incomes of the highly skilled in a few cities, among which are LA. Now, so now I come back to the housing story. What this means is that for this, let's take this top 30% that are in a place like LA. It turns out that, yes, they are facing housing costs that have risen, but actually their wage premium has risen more than their housing costs.
Right.
So though they might feel like they're suffering really terribly, the numbers don't bear that out, at least in objective terms. I think in subjective terms, they probably do feel that they're not getting housed as well as the previous generation that got in when LA was a smaller, cheaper place. But in terms of the proportion of their incomes that they devote to housing, they're actually, in recent years, it's been declining somewhat for the upper tier of the income distribution. But now let's take the problem of the other 70%, okay? So the 70% who are not college degree educated, highly skilled people. Now let's clone one of them. And so they do a clone of them, and one person lives in LA and the other one lives in Phoenix. Unlike the skilled person, their wages are almost identical. There's no substantial advantage to living here if you're in the lower 70% in terms of wages. But the problem is that there are higher housing costs. So the proportion of income they're devoting to housing is rising, and the proportion of income the top 30% is devoting is declining. So the point here is that there isn't one housing, there isn't a single general housing crisis. There is, in the simplest sense, two very different realities that the numbers show, okay? So it's perfectly understandable that everyone complains about housing in what we call these superstar cities, okay? But the on-the-ground realities are really different. For the upper segment, they are getting housed and they still have more disposable income here than they would if they lived in Dallas. But they subjectively feel like, I'm a skilled person, but like my parents, they have a better house than I am. And so how come I don't have the house that my parents had? And that's really it's a historical process where LA isn't a cheap expanding city the way that it was in the 50s and 60s. Dallas is like that today. Atlanta is like that today. They have vast new suburbs on the suburban fringe. You get cheap land, you mass produce housing, and everyone can get access to it, and it cheapens the whole housing market. But our sprawl hit the wall a long time ago, and then we started to fill in and get denser. And so that era of our superstar cities will never return. But the lower 70%, that is really where the penalty is, okay? Contrary to, so the point is this, that the really suffering group where their wages are not compensating the rise in housing costs in these now mature cities is this bottom 70%, and that's a lot. 70% is most people, all right? And let me sort of give you, translate this into what it means in housing policy. So for all intents and purposes, everybody, the 70% is what you might call the low-income population. That's shocking. You can say, how can 70% of people be low income? Remember, this is sort of, economics, but in the reason is because of inequality. So here in LA, in the city of LA, we define someone as a low-income household that has 80% of the area's mean income, or the average income, okay? Now, so I don't know how many people have taken statistics, but when you have high inequality, the average and the middle point, they diverge from one another, okay? So, in LA, because of high income inequality, the average is actually pretty low relative to the middle point. What that means is that if you take 80% of the area average income and you find what percentage of households has less than 80% of area average income, it's, guess what, 70%. Okay? So even current housing law basically recognizes that to house the bottom 70%, right, is effectively to house a relatively low income group. All right, so that's perspective. And I wanted to give that because in the housing debate, we have this sort of idea that, it tends to be conducted without that perspective that's both historical and more broadly societal and economic. Okay, so now how do they link the two? Let's go back to them and their story. Their story is, and it's endorsed by the way, a lot of really good economists. So I want to say that because I have a lot of colleagues that I respect who see the story differently from me, and that's typical in academia. What they say is, well, yes, but that's the filtering story, is if you build from the top, that you will loosen the housing market up more generally and allow these people at the bottom to get better housed. It's kind of like a great vacancy change. Now, that's where I think the actual sort of thinking about zoning changes gets really hard to imagine in one's head. Let me give some metaphors. I think one that sort of captures their way of thinking is you have a pond and you throw a rock in the middle of the pond, okay? The rock is the new construction or luxury housing, and you get a ripple effect, right? The ripple effect is stronger the closer in time and the closer in distance you are to where the rock lands or falls into the water, and there's at some point where the ripple effects wear out and are no longer having the ripple effect at all. Okay, so that's kind of their idea about zoning shock therapy, is it would do something like that, and that's how serving the top 30% will benefit not only the top 30%, but the bottom 70%, and all the neighborhoods where the bottom 70% live. Right? So this is thinking about this at a kind of broad scale. So I think actually, interestingly enough, there's one point that we all agree on, and that is that zoning shock therapy will, in the first instance, unleash a boom in luxury construction. That's what it's all about. Okay? Actually, I don't even hear Scott Wiener saying no to that. I think they're admitting that. So this is the point, is we really have to zero in on this supposed trickle-down effect, whereby serving the top, everything and all neighborhoods, every kind of people and all kinds of neighborhoods are going to end up benefiting through the ripple effect or the filtering. All right, that's kind of the core claim that they're making. Now, so here's how I'll add another metaphor, which is there are things that can cause ripple effects in ponds. Right? I'm not a hydrologist, by the way, but you can also have forces that push water back toward the center. Right? In an ocean, a powerful tsunami wave will actually raise the water level, or a storm can do that. And that, I think, is the way to think about the structural changes in our society. That any time you try to do the ripple, you're going to get this, the water is going to wash back toward the center. And with it, the benefits will wash back up the hierarchy of incomes and back toward a few neighborhoods and won't have the spread effect. So I'm going to contrast the ripple with and the spread with what you might call the backwash in and up. And let me tell you why I think that, okay? To get that, I want to sort of turn to some scenarios, which are the ones I kind of laid out in San Francisco. And so this is, maybe you can have a general point here, which is that the whole debate that's been conducted, what sort of bothers me about it is that, you know, I'd like to believe in a trickle-down theory. I mean, if we can pull that off and benefit in the name of the greater good, we construct some housing and there's going to be this major change in how well people get housed, and a whole bunch of other neighborhoods are going to improve, and people are going to have a better lives, especially at the bottom 70%, which is a population that's done really poorly in the third industrial revolution. That's something that, you know, I'd be perfectly happy to believe in if I could see the proof, right? And what I want to do now is, what I've tried to do with my colleagues is try to tease out how that scenario could work out. And any way that we turn, we find that it doesn't work out that way. We find that, in fact, it's the opposite, and there are all kinds of unintended consequences. So that's what I want to talk about a few minutes here. So, one of the implicit ideas in that zoning shock therapy that the YIMBY movement is producing is that that basically we've been gentrifying certain neighborhoods, and if you would just build us enough housing in the places where we really want to live, then we'll go home. In other words, we'll stop gentrifying, or we'll go back out of the gentrified neighborhoods into the places we wanted to live in the first place. And that way, those other communities will sort of be under less pressure. They'll loosen up. So think about, now we do have a few of these gentrified areas in our California metropolises. Venice is an iconic gentrified place. Silver Lake here in LA. The Mission District, further afield, Brooklyn in New York, or the Back Bay in Boston, or Adams Morgan in Washington, D.C., right? These are iconic gentrification stories. And you'll notice that a lot of the criticism of the gentrification comes from the moderate income people who kind of used to, live there in a tranquil way, and they find themselves under pressure from a lot of rich people these days. Okay, so imagine then this idea that, great, we'll build a lot of luxury housing somewhere else, and the gentrifiers will clear out and leave us alone again. Okay? So, now before I tell you do a scenario, I actually want to give you another irresistible academic point, which is about gentrification in general. And that is that outside of a few iconic neighborhoods in a few cities, mostly Washington, New York, Boston, LA, and San Francisco, and a teeny bit in Miami, guess what? There's hardly any gentrification in America. So what do I mean by that? There's an academic at Harvard named Robert Sampson, who is, I think, kind of the best urban, or the most prominent urban sociologist in America. So they examined 50,000 urban census tracts. Those are the little micro neighborhoods you vote in. And they found that there are literally only a handful of gentrified ones, meaning areas that used to be poor and that moved several ranks up in the economic ladder, okay? The ones I cited to you are among the rare areas of gentrification in America. And we do happen to have them here in LA and San Francisco somewhat. But the point, the broader point is this. The problem in America is actually that we don't, I'll put this in quotation marks, because I could get really misinterpreted. From one perspective, there's a problem that we don't have more gentrification. We don't have enough. Okay, why? Because gentrification is a form of economic desegregation. It's where richer people and poorer people actually live close to one another. And the bottom line is that America is just as segregated by income today as it has ever been. And that leads to, if you are a disadvantaged person, it leads to the reproduction of compounded urban or spatial and social disadvantage. Because poor people and lower income people are pretty isolated among themselves in this country. And I'll just put it right out there, I think it's a terrible problem for our society. There's a philosopher called Elizabeth Anderson, who I think is the most eloquent person talking about issues of equality today. And she wrote a book called The Imperative of Integration. That integration in America means racial integration, and I think we know about that issue. But it also means economic integration. That society where people aren't mixing together is, in the long run, not a healthy society in many ways. I'll just put that out there. okay? But here's the point. We have in the third industrial revolution reproduced this economic segregation by income just as much as it ever has been the case. So it's not an agenda item on most, but I think people should just be aware of that. But now let me return to my de-gentrification scenario. And I want to use something that's easy to grasp visually, which is New York City, okay? You've got Brooklyn there, you've got Manhattan there, right? So, each of them is an island, and so think about this scenario. Brooklyn has 2.6 million people, and Manhattan has 1.67 million people. Brooklyn has, in this high income category, 26% of people in Brooklyn have a college degree or more. A little bit under the national average. Brooklyn is an icon of gentrification and hipsterdom, right? All these people who couldn't move to Manhattan have moved to Brooklyn. It's been, there's all kinds of construction, the neighborhoods have changed. It's like Venice and Silver Lake, and all these hipster places. Okay, now, so here's the experiment. What the economists say is that we need to build a lot more housing in Manhattan. And then Manhattan, just like LA or San Francisco, is over-regulated. All right? So I would remind people that, so the average density of LA is 7,000 people a square mile. In West Hollywood, which is the peak here, it's 24,000 people, just like San Francisco, the city of San Francisco. That if you go to Brooklyn, it's 37,000 people per square mile. And if you go to Manhattan, it's 67,000 people per square mile. And another one, so the three densest urban areas in the world are the island of Manhattan, Paris inside its ring road, and Hong Kong. All right, all with roughly that kind of density. But they all look different. Hong Kong is towers, New York is towers, Paris is kind of like 7 stories everywhere. All right, now, so continue the scenario. Let's not even say that all 26% college educated would move back to Manhattan. Let's just take the top of the top, which is 9.6% of Brooklynites have graduate degrees. So we're going to take that as a top kind of tranche of people. That's about 250,000 people. So now we build 250,000 housing units, and they all move back across the river. And they liberate 250,000 units in Brooklyn, okay? So now the story is, from the zoning shock people, the story is, I think, that miraculously, these existing Brooklynites who are there are gonna move up into this vacated housing, okay? And in the great chain, everyone, in the musical chairs game that will be unleashed by that everyone in Brooklyn will be better housed or more cheaply housed as the gentrifiers go back home. Okay, so this is where I think the problem, this is where the sort of general points about housing, when you try to convert them into really concrete scenarios, this is where I start to have some difficulty. For one thing, I could think about that, Brooklyn is part of a vast urban area that's interconnected, like LA, where jobs and housing are interconnected over a very wide area containing about 21 or 22 million people. And there's probably a lot of other people in New York who would like to live in Brooklyn too, right? I'm imagining that there's, people maybe in Long Island or in Jersey or wherever who might want to move into Brooklyn for a variety of reasons, especially because Brooklyn has actually been improved a lot with the presence of the gentrifiers. Even though they might have displaced some people, they've also brought in a lot of money and new amenities. So Brooklyn's pretty nice, and now it's attractive to a lot of people. So in the law of unintended consequences, you drive the gentrifiers back to Manhattan, but there are other gentrifiers who want to move in and take their place. Perfectly reasonable. I'm not saying it's good or bad, it's just how the things work. Or, so the point is, we don't know the who or the where of the ripple effect, right? But now I want to turn to Manhattan. Okay, so Manhattan is one of the densest urban areas in the world right now. This does not prevent the zoning shock people from saying, you know, that it's, and they're right, by the way, it's highly regulated, and like any urban area, it's pretty complicated to try and build or change anything in Manhattan. That's life. But 250,000 people is a 15% population increase for Manhattan. So it's already twice the density of Brooklyn, and you're going to add 15% people. Now, in this world, we have different ideas about whether we like density or not. I think that's the point. We make choices based on different ways we want to live, as well as the kind of means that we have. But the sort of economics of it are this. If you add 15% new housing units to to Manhattan, there are likely to be unintended effects or secondary effects on the land prices and land markets in Manhattan itself, meaning that land would become more valuable because you would be able to build more densely on it. And then what is left of the relatively moderate density buildings in Manhattan would have to be converted to high density buildings. But when you change construction methods or replace an old building with a new one, the cost of the units goes up. Above a certain number of floors, if anyone's in construction, you know what that means. The systems and the methods get more expensive, so even though you're adding more units, you don't divide the old cost by the number of new units. You have to price it in at the construction methods you use for a newer, taller building. Bearing in mind that the price of land has just gone up and the landowner's gonna want a piece of the action. So here's the point, that now we have the 250,000 people from Brooklyn, they're going back to Manhattan, but the price of the added units it's in fact gone the other way for Manhattan. Manhattan has become generally more expensive than it was to begin with. So zoning shocking Manhattan doesn't shock and keep the same price baseline. It shocks and creates a change in the prices, possibly defeating or wiping out the purpose of densifying Manhattan in the first place. That's how markets work, right? Markets have really complex feedback effects. So this is the kind of thing that you want to think about. Now take it here to SB 50. What's interesting is that in SB 50, the key sort of and most radical change that it proposes is to allow denser projects in single-family home neighborhoods. Right? We're not going to go to high-rises in single-family home neighborhoods. Those will be reserved for the arterials. But think about a single-family home neighborhood where you could go from a single-family home up to a maximum of 10 units. Now, one point to remember there is in those projects there are zero affordability requirements, zero. All right. But what about the cost structure of those projects? So here in California, you wouldn't be going to those high-rise construction methods, but the land cost, the land value amortized over a relatively small project will drive the per unit cost of those projects way up. Because no landowners will understand, I can go from one house to 10 units here, my land value is worth this, I'm not going to let the developer take it all and sell you at the land value that it had before. I'm going to sell to you at the land value it has now. And that's amortized over 10 units or less, mechanically driving their prices up to a level where the affordability component, even for the wealthy people that are targeted, is is put into doubt. So here's the point. When you start to think in this way, it seems to me that neither the academics nor the public officials that are writing the legislation have really worked out the scenarios, done the modeling, and told us exactly how the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth order effects are going to work, right? Which are the ones that I would want to know about before I would approve a radical change in the way that we organize land use in our cities. There's a whole set of academic tools that we have for that. The basic way that you would do it is you would create a model of a city with its housing markets, its different neighborhoods, its people, meaning the kinds of labor force you have and the kinds of incomes they have, and you would create a complex model with feedbacks, and you'd run that model. Or alternatively, what you would do is something even fancier, which is you take a group of cities where, with a certain set of characteristics, and you try to find cities where something like zoning shock therapy has already been done. Like you'd say Toronto or Barcelona or London, which has been done in. And you then take a bunch of other cities where it hasn't been done, and you'd adjust them to be sort of identical, synthetically identical or falsely identical, but in a useful way in their baseline. And then you'd say, if I apply the shock to these places, what's gonna happen to them that would be like Toronto, Barcelona, and London, or different? Weirdly enough, it's an obvious academic task, and I haven't found anyone that's done it. I've found, in other words, what you find is little studies that say, we took a neighborhood in this city, we built some luxury housing, we saw that there was, there was filtering of these people, but it's, and those aren't bad results. I don't want to, I want to be really careful. These are excellent, in academic terms, these are excellent academic studies. What's the problem with them is they haven't been scaled up to the level of whole cities and regions, which is what the SB 50 is proposing to do, is to do a general zoning shock on a whole state, right? So when you scale up from what we call small results to big ones, that's where you get all of these feedbacks and unintended consequences, and that we should be told about, right? So my point back to the proposers is, go back and do some more work, because you need to make a more effective case, and until you've made it, there's no reason for us to believe that you have a credible case, right? That's what I call due diligence. There's a whole bunch of other scenarios. I don't want to spend too much. I went through a bunch of them in San Francisco, but I think you kind of get the gist of what I'm saying. That, but I want to say maybe two sort of wrinkles on this scenario. What about the claim that in the bigger projects that would be authorized by SB 50, so not the single family home up to 10 units, that's exempted from affordability requirements, which I find very surprising. But let's talk about the bigger projects that are probably going to be built in other areas, like on arterials. It's been very popular in urban planning circles to propose inclusionary or affordability requirements in those buildings. And SB 50 has some of that written into it. Roughly speaking, when I read through the legislation, which is more and more complex, so you have to do a lot of close reading as this bill gets more complicated. But the basic story is, in the range of 25 to 29% of the units would have to be for low, very low, or extremely low income people. Okay, so now what's the idea there? The idea in the narrative is that vibrant, mixed income, urban community thing, right? You build these projects, you use market rate development to finance the low income development, you include people, you mix them literally in the same building, and you're doing well by doing good, all right? And I think people can see the intuitively appealing nature of that. I mean, I actually kind of like that, I mean, I spent most of my time, I grew up in dense cities, I happen to like all that stuff, so why not? I think the problem though is that we have experience with those kinds of inclusionary write-ins, where study after study shows that the results are not the ones that were promised. Okay, so why aren't we getting those results? And I think there's a few things that come out in the policy evaluation literature. And this is interesting because a lot of the planning profession that's endorsing SB 50 has also concluded that a lot of these inclusionary write-ins haven't delivered the results that they have, that they were counting on. And I think there's two things. So one of them is, what do we mean by inclusion? And this is where the God is in the details, okay? So let me give you an example from here in LA, and far from here in Santa Monica. So there's a place called, anybody know what Dorset Gardens is?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so let's talk about Dorset Gardens, which is a garden-style apartment complex built in the 1940s in the Crenshaw area. And as you all know, Crenshaw is about to get a major new metro rail line. Also, the heart of our historically African-American community. And it's also where you find a lot of community groups that have mobilized against SB 50. Interesting, just think about that one, right? This is a relatively low-income community, but there are many, many community meetings there where people are mobilized. So I think that's actually, I'll come back to that, because it's one of the things that most annoys me about the narrative. It's, you know, it's true, we're out here on the west side, I don't mean to be politically incorrect, we're kind of white out here, but there are a lot of other communities in our region that are also uncomfortable with this bill who look different from us. All right, so we're not all, right? No, I think it's really important because we're being painted in one way, and I think that's a corrective that needs to happen. But let's go into what's actually going on. So there's a major developer there that's proposing to raise Dorset Gardens and build a big new mixed income development with all kinds of facilities, greater density, and so on. Okay, so in some ways, I mean, I had a look at the project and it's got some interesting features, and notably, it's in a jobs-rich area now with a good transit line, and there probably are reasons to upgrade the housing and add some units. But here's where we get into the details of the affordability problem. The developer's proposal overtly proposes to eliminate 206 low and very low income units and replace them with only 141. That's just straightforwardly there, okay?
Right, that's
But-
crazy.
So that is a failure of enforcement by the city of LA, okay? Just straightforwardly on the numbers proposed by the developer. And you're right, we would ask, where will those people go? All right, and that's something that could lead some of them to be on the street in our homelessness crisis. But that's not all, actually. That's just the beginning of the problem. It's how do they define low and very low income? How they define it is that 80% of area mean income for Los Angeles, which is about $83,000 for a family of 4. But the problem is, this is like a basic geographer's point, is don't use average geographies, use specific geographies. And the specific area mean income for the area around Dorset Gardens is $41,000. So this is perfectly legal gaming the system. Not only, even if you went back to the 206 units and they were defined relative to the AMI of 80% of AMI, which is 83,000, you would basically be eliminating all of the affordable housing in that project in a perfectly legal way. This is exactly what's happened in New York City over and over and over again. All right? It's happened in Chicago. It's happened in Minneapolis. So you can not a week goes by that we don't read some kind of evaluation of some supposedly well-intentioned inclusionary zoning law where the results didn't happen. All right, so the other thing, of course, is just about simple enforceability. We're a vast state. There are going to be tens of thousands of housing projects that would be unleashed by zoning change. There already are. And who's out there minding the shop and monitoring them? who's monitoring every project and every change, representing the affordability constituency? Where are the lawyers? Where are the zoning experts? Are the planning offices well-staffed enough? And it's hard to believe that when our new zoning board in Sacramento gets a hold of this, that they're gonna be tracing every project and measuring and enforcing all of these effects. So, now, then so that's only part of it. Let's do the last chapter in this story. Let's assume a better world. Let's take the scenario on its own terms. We have great offices that monitor every project. We write the affordability requirements exactly the way they should be. We get affordable units in there for the really low income people, and we make the market rate housing pay for the affordable housing. What happens then? Then we know is that developers don't get interested anymore, because either they have to jack the prices of the market rate units way up to super luxury. That's what happened in New York, right? So that the clients then, who could pay those kind of prices, weren't interested in being in buildings with people who were of such different income levels from them. You can like it or not like it. This is just, being analytical about how the world works. Or the developer said, I can't make this project work anymore because now my market rate units have gotten so high that relative to the neighborhood where I wanted to build them in, given its amenities, no one will buy them. So laws of economics are pretty strict. If you game it out, you can't promise everything to everybody, and that's why I think once again I don't think the scenarios written into this bill are right. Okay, so let me sort of just conclude by saying that I think there's one last thing, and this is something that really bothers me about our housing situation. And I'll do it by anecdote. About a month ago, I told this story in San Francisco, but in the School of Public Affairs, we have, as we do at UCLA, a lot of excellent staff people who run the institution in many ways, beyond the teaching staff like me, and the administrative staff that I work with. So I've known her for 20 years, and I bumped into her in the hallway one day coming out of the elevator, and I said, how you doing today? Usual office chit chat. And she says, really tired. What's going on? She says, well, I get up at 4 in the morning. And why do you get up at 4 in the morning? Well, because I take the van pool to UCLA, because we moved to Chino.
Wow.
Right.
Wow.
So Westwood to Chino. Now, good employer, van pool, only 2 hours each way, right? Come in, get to work at 7, leave at 4, staggered against traffic. But by the way, folks, this is the reality of a certain part of our middle classes today, especially those who have families and who have wages that don't enable them to live anywhere near their jobs, okay? It's the vast part of the Inland Empire in the Bay Area. It's the spillover into the Central Valley near Tracy and Stockton with this gigantic, commuting that is, imagine, the time constraints it puts on people, not to mention all of the other collateral damage. And here's the point. What is zoning shock therapy going to do for them? Right? I'm not saying that the bill has to do everything for everybody, but the vision that the ripple in the pond, when you construct a luxury housing in the highly desirable areas, like out here in West LA, that somehow it's gonna mean that Gwen can come back from Chino and find a cheaper house closer to where she works, it's not gonna happen. And we know it's not gonna happen, right? That the ripple won't get that far. So that's the point about thinking that without specific policies for specific and variegated housing problems, not a one-size-fits-all. The problem, I think, with SB 50 and like legislation is it's a one-size-fits-all. There's like a miracle solution. You just do zoning shock therapy, everything else kind of filters and ripples and solves all of these different problems. but it's a story that's too good to be true, because I don't think it is true. And the main message that I would have is that we need to have much better due diligence on evaluating proposals like that. And the last thing I'd say is the point I made a couple minutes ago, is I don't like the political good people, bad people setup that's emerged in this. Fine, there are, if we want to start sort of saying that every side is full of evil people, we won't have a debate here that's constructive. People, I think, have a variety of reasons for being concerned about zoning shock therapy. Everybody is not out there because they're just selfish, rich white NIMBYs or whatever, however they want to propose. Just as on the other side, they're not all horrible people who want to tear our cities up. Motivations are mixed, and the only way to get to have a constructive approach to changing our cities or rebuilding them is to be really clearly logical and evidence-based, to have concrete scenarios that work to inform us about what's likely to happen from a given kind of policy. And I don't think we've gotten there yet. So I'll stop there and happy to take questions and have debate.
We touched on it before the meeting, and that is the use of homelessness to sort of feed the flames of SB 50.
Well, I mean, I think that's part of the general problem here of the way the whole thing is being represented or spun, right? Is that on the one side, there are homeowners who are stubborn and anti-progress and only looking out for themselves, and that by not allowing a massive construction boom, that somehow all of these people got homeless. So it's interesting though, you have over here this cause and over here this effect, but how are they actually linked, right? In my view, I'm not an expert on homelessness, but my sense of it is that that obviously housing costs are a part of homelessness. If someone loses their house and can't find housing again, they're gonna end up homeless. But more deeply behind that are structural forces. Like, why do we have so many people who are in such a precarious economic position in the first place? What is it that you have a rich society where people have no savings, no access to having a job, to the point where they can't, the minute something happens to them, their entire lives fall apart? Housing plays a role in that, but it's a tail wagging the dog argument, in the sense the story of homelessness is multifaceted and structural, relating to a lot of low-wage, low-income people, oftentimes with social dysfunction, personally from mental illness or other kinds of things, or things that affect their families and cause them to not have good support networks. So housing is one link, but again, reducing a really complex social problem to one thing. Okay, if we just had more luxury building, then somehow everything would be cheaper, and that person who lost their job and didn't have any savings and couldn't make their rent payments will miraculously get back into housing. Well, I would say, show me. So now you're going to have to moderate this.
Okay.
All right, you have to.
Okay, Alice.
What solutions do you have on a small level, if not on a state level? In housing?
Small level meaning?
Smaller geographical.
Okay, so I'm going to actually say there that I'm not an expert in proposing housing policy. To be perfectly honest, what I've done is I've done a critical analysis of this kind of thinking, but I don't have great expertise in that. There's a few things that I hear from my colleagues. For example, one of the most successful policies that one of my colleagues wrote about is the U.S. Housing Voucher Program, where people are given income subsidies or vouchers they can use for housing costs. And it turns out that looks pretty successful, and it probably needs to be really substantially expanded. And that comes, but that means that the society has to come to terms with the public purse and paying. Because if you're gonna have a low-wage society with prosperous cities that automatically will have high housing costs, then you've gotta make up the difference somehow.
Yeah.
Right? So I'll give you another example that I heard from someone who's working actually close to our city administration. It may be time, I'm just saying, think out of the box. I think about a major employer like UCLA. I'm glad that we have van pools, but UCLA or a major hospital or major corporations, generally speaking, we have a bunch of high salaried people and a bunch of low salaried people. That's just the way it works. In the past, they would have bought up land and developed it and housed some of their employees in it. In the university world, New York University does exactly this. Anybody know NYU, right? Anybody know a faculty member? Guess what? They have a huge chunk of lower Manhattan that they own. It's off-market rates, and that's how they recruit people and keep them. And you know, with the structural return to cities, there's no way to avoid the fact that land and housing are going to be expensive. So we might have to start thinking out of the box to solve the problems.
Yes. Your question. We've got a question.
I have a question about Gwen. Would she prefer to live in a 10-unit apartment in West LA or in a single-family home in Chino?
So I think that's another good point. The vision of creating density for, say, Gwen and her family is one that we actually haven't tested against her desires and preferences. And one thing that we do note is that very few of these developments, except at the super luxury level, generate actually spaces that families with kids want to live in, right? In some other cities and parts of the world, you get more of that, but it's not something that we do a lot in California. There's a whole set of issues there about what kind of projects would we be able to develop in the neighborhoods where, you know, to get Gwen closer to work and house her in a way that she'd feel comfortable. Totally, right? And I haven't seen that scenario either.
Yes.
How can we, I'm very interested in the use of models to play out the first, second, third tier consequences of a statewide zoning requirement. How can we as individual citizens push that kind of an approach? Right, to our assemblyman or a senator?
Run for city council.
No, I mean, I would simply say that, you know, as citizens, that we should be insistent on asking the proposers to develop evidence that can be widely vetted, both by experts, but also explained to people who are not experts, and to show us the scenarios that of change that they're really envisaging. And, you know, in the past, I mean, you would have something like the Legislative Analyst's Office or the Office of Planning and Research who would do some of that work. But you could also, you know, you should also be able to farm it out to places like UCLA or you know, or a think tank or whatever. That's kind of standard practice with major policy proposals. When, for example, when we do we sign a new trade agreement, you get, you know, contracts with academics who run these giant models that show you how all the parts of the society will be affected, which industries, which jobs, which regions. Now the models, to be honest, sometimes they're off. In fact, they're really hard to get them right, and you should never believe, you know, models will never give you a perfect picture of the future in an uncertain and changing world. But at least they're like some kind of, at least they're giving us like sort of order of magnitude estimates or scenarios that we should be able then to talk about.
The most important thing a model does, I think, is force you to think. Forces you to think.
Yeah.
And it sounds like SB 50 hasn't had a lot of thinking.
I don't think it's had the due diligence done. I think you get kind of everyone doing sort of, use of it, like that paper supports me and that statistic. But again, that's part of the political process, right? People selectively use evidence.
Sure.
But when you try to get to something big like this, you need realistic scenario building that we can all talk about.
Yes.
You mentioned that in Barcelona, Toronto, and also in London, that something similar, not exactly the same as SB 50 is proposing. What were the results of those three experiments?
Super booms in super luxury apartment buildings. In Toronto, sprouting towers all over the downtown, and they're mostly quite expensive luxury towers, and basically no affordability benefit. Barcelona, after the Olympics, so already that's the nice thing is we have a long run of time to evaluate Barcelona. The city did the most ambitious urban replanning. By the way, much admired in certain ways. They modernized the waterfront and kind of made it into a groovy tourist center. But in the housing market, they did vast upzoning in the new parts of the city, and you got basically luxury housing construction, and the city's become more expensive, but actually economically, it's lagged behind Madrid. London, the Olympics was the same thing. All of the eastern part of the London region was dramatically upzoned. Vast tracts of land were given over to new housing building, and mostly luxury, and almost no effect on affordability. Well, it's those kind of cautionary examples that we need to think about, and then we need to put them in our California context. That's what you would do, and say, are we similar to or different from that, and what's going to happen here?
So that I leave this meeting less depressed. In academia where you are, is there a place in the Western world, in Europe, whatever, that you would use as a model of what to do, what not to do?
Good question. Let me give you a couple of examples that suggest some elements. Of course, the typical thing is if we're going to look at the Nordic countries, always the paradises of the world and all that. But these are countries. There's a few countries in Europe with really active housing policies. Sweden, Denmark, among them, the Netherlands. The one cautionary element there, and that's a point about extending an example from one place to another, is that those places don't have the same demographics that we do. They don't have the same population growth, and they don't have the same income inequality. So it's easier to fill in the gaps in a more egalitarian, more slow-growing society than in a highly unequal, fast-growing one like us. My other case that I know intimately well would be France. And in France, we have 25% public housing in Paris, including in the center. And public housing there means low and moderate income. So it is somewhat successful, but not perfectly successful.
That's where I grew up, so I should go back.
So it depends on whether you want to live in what's called an HLM. Yeah, habitation à loyer modéré. So yes, there's a lot of that. The big problem there is actually that it's such good housing,
Really?
so well located, that people who are not low income, it's the opposite of here, they want to get in and stay in. So what the problem we have in France is getting them out. And so having them, especially people who are connected, they game the system to stay into the public housing, so much of it is so nice.
That would never happen here.
So it's the opposite of here, right?
Yeah, right.
So, yeah, but we do need to look around the world and think about that stuff.
Yes.
Number one, I think your presentation was wonderful, and I'm glad we went through chapter by chapter, so thank you. When something is under discussion in Sacramento, there's normally a body of folks who are going to benefit significantly, are pressing hard for it to occur, just the way it's been introduced. And so my question is, I think, Tricia, you said that the bill is put over for further consideration next year. Who will be the major advocates of passing it just the way it is, just the way it's been proposed?
I think the same ones who are advocating today will be, I think they'll be back next year.
And specifically who?
Oh, actually, I think, I actually haven't done a detailed analysis, but I think probably, there are other people who have been writing, like 48 Hills wrote a really good piece of, I think, about who's been sort of backing it. And you can see lots of different groups, ranging from across the ideological spectrum. You can find the YIMBY group, the developers, certain politicians, right?
Yeah, in fact, like if you go on the legislative information page, Leg Info, if you type that in, and then you go to the bill, and then you look on the votes. At the end, so you look on, let's say, the Housing Committee, and you look on the votes. Under that on that page, there will be a list of all the organizations that have supported the bill and all the organizations that have opposed the bill. So that kind of gives you, and they're very transparent about it because those organizations that supported it wanted to be on the record, as did the opposition. So you'll get a really good sense of the two different camps.
Yes.
I think a more general question. You talked in the beginning about this reverse flight back into the cities as a consequence of one of your items was information technology, which seems to be the opposite of what we thought. We were supposed to be working at home because we're back in the burbs.
Yeah.
So if we're chasing getting more housing for cities now, what happens when 5G comes along, if America ever gets its act together and has 5G while the rest of the world has it? We could then have another flight out of the cities while everyone is instantaneously working from their own homes, out in the burbs.
I think that's unlikely to happen. And okay, so this is one of the really like wonky fun things about cities and economic geography is, if you look at every time we've had a revolution in technologies of communication or transportation, that in principle would allow things to spread out or be farther away from one another. It actually has what's called a direct effect and an indirect effect. The direct effect is certain things go away. So, give you an example, in the 1950s, when in this country we built the interstate highway system, a lot of manufacturing went first to the suburbs and then it went to the south. So that's sort of like the intuitive part is new technology, things spread out. The counterintuitive or the indirect effect is that every technological revolution produces a new group of knowledge-based, creative or inventive activities in the economy, and they need to be spatially clustered. It happens every single time. For 200 years, it happened with the canals. You got things spread out, but you got cities grew more. Then you got the railroads, and you got another wave of urbanization. So that there's a permanent feature is that new technologies allow what we call routine activities to spread apart, but they concentrate the creative, innovative, deal-making parts of the economy where the people who are at the cutting edge of the economy need to be during that period. All right? So urbanization is here to stay. Right now, 40% of all jobs in America are on 1.5% of its land area. And 60% of American jobs are on 12% of its land area. The percentages are increasing, not declining.
Wait, just say those again. One.
40%, 1 point, what did I just say, 1.5, 60%, 12%. And those are going up, not down.
So, Michael, so on what you said, knowing that Milton Friedman was wrong, it's been proved out now. There's another aspect, two things that if you could speak to. One is the carrying capacity of any city. Infrastructure, and if any of you try to get out of Santa Monica at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. And second is actual occupancy rates. I know people who live in Playa Vista, have thousands of units there, and they offer them free months just to renew their lease because the buildings are half empty at the very best. Do we really have a housing shortage, or do we have an affordable housing shortage?
So I think your latter question is really, pretty close to my general analysis, right? The market right now can produce housing that's addressed to, let's say, max, the core of the metropolitan area is top 30%, and even there's evidence that it might not even be able to hit the top 30, but is only hitting a smaller percentage. And as a result, we've seen a lot of projects come online that are not filled because they're basically too expensive. There's one, I live near Beverly and La Brea. There's a project at Wilshire and La Brea, and I learned the other day that it's a third filled. And it's one of these, everything has got a gym and the whole, groovy thing. So, yes, amenities. So I think there's something there. I don't know enough about that, but I think there's enough evidence that we need to look into it really closely. All right, and that's it. So that's obviously unaffordable even for the top tier. So what's going on there?
Yeah.
Right? And then I think your issue about carrying capacity is, it's that we are, let's take the LA case, is,
Just define that for you.
yeah, so, well, carrying capacity, it's a term borrowed from ecology, which is the notion of, a distribution of activity or species relative to some system for sustaining them, right? If you want to give it that kind. It's not language I use, but I'm kind of taking your language. But I think in the field of urban economics or urban planning, the real issue is it's housing, location, and transportation are the golden triangle. That is, if you're going to concentrate a certain number of activities at certain levels of density, you have to have systems that enable them to be served with different kinds of amenities, but also enabling them to get around. And here I think we need to remember something that LA is the only great sort of world city region in the developed world that was built essentially for the automobile. Okay, it was laid down with a very specific technology, and London, Paris, and New York are older. London, Paris, New York, and Tokyo are the other super cities of the developed world. There's 5 of them, okay? 5 of them with more than 10 million people in the developed world. Most of the other super cities in the world are in the developing world. They're like Shanghai or Sao Paulo or Mexico City. So you can't compare them really. But of our 5, LA is the only one that was laid out at relatively low density for the automobile. And the thing that's specifically happening here, and you could extend it a bit to the Bay Area, because we talk about San Francisco, but it's just a little piece of the broader Bay Area, which is basically similar to suburban California. So we have a problem in that there's not really a model for how to do a density transition in this kind of metropolitan area where we have the demand for us. It's the same demand that's faced in London or Paris or New York or Tokyo, but they have a totally different urban structure for adding people, right? You can like it or not like it, but they already have it, right? You can add people in those, and you've already got a transportation system, and you've got proximities. What do? Nobody knows.
We're not there yet.
Yeah, I think we need to think it through,
Yeah.
and maybe we'll invent something.
Leslie had a question.
My question is sort of similar to his. What about the infrastructure in terms of the sewers and the water lines and all of those things? When you're increasing density, we already have problems in Westwood, actually. And we have all these water main breaks all over the city, and we're having all these problems. How are you going to deal with the increase in the cities with the sewer lines and all the other problems?
To be honest, I don't think that's it's a technical question. What I mean there is, we have a generally deteriorating infrastructure in this country, right? So we've just, we've let our systems deteriorate by under-investing in them. So that's, you can make good urban infrastructure if you want. It costs money. It just depends on whether you want to pay for it or not.
Yes, Stella.
Also, this country is very unique compared to Europe in terms of migration and job driven. People constantly moving from state to state, and of course, certain states are more popular, so get more attraction by job. So once they place people in like location that some people might be interested in terms of jobs or school or whatever, then it happens that they lose the job, they're gonna go to another state. So this constantly migration, nationwide, and then also internationally, constantly they have people who are most attracted to this country, and they come in major states, major cities, but it still is happening, all constantly moving. It's very unique in this country compared to Europe and other countries.
Yeah, so you're right. This is like
Factor.
a basic thing about the U.S. is that we have a growing population and a somewhat younger population than most of Europe, right? Europe is slower demographically and somewhat older than us. And that has sort of, it's like a glass, it cuts both ways, meaning that means that in European countries that sort of just brute pressure on cities is lower, because the population dynamics aren't as active as ours. On the other hand, we were talking about this before, Europe has its own problem, because if you don't have an influx of young people, you get into problems with paying for the older people, but also for injecting, new energy and all that into a society. But the point is this. So if we have a demographically attractive, dynamic country, which I think is a great thing to have, it does make our cities come under pressure. And in particular, in the post-1980 context, that context of a handful of cities in America, it's not all cities. There's no affordability crisis in Houston or Atlanta or Las Vegas or Phoenix. And why? Because they're doing what we did in the 1950s. They can still do it. They're adding cheap housing, and they're taking the desert in the case of Phoenix. They develop it with mass production methods. All income classes move out. It is a giant filtering mechanism. But the reason you can't bring that back here is that our sprawl has already hit the wall. We did it, and it's over. It's a one-time option. One day, Phoenix will hit the wall, and Dallas will hit the wall, and by the way, with a lot of environmental damage. Mm-hmm. I can't believe we would do that today knowing what it does. Mm-hmm. But I'm not, that's just not a moral judgment, it's just like just sort of a looking at history. The fact is, we did it, it's done, and now we have a structurally different situation, which is accommodating people in a more unequal distribution of income, and like you say, with a lot of coming and going. So that's the kind of framework we need to think about.
Jill, you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to ask you, since LA is going to get the Olympics, and the mayor's been really humping it, what is it about having the Olympics that made these cities just build tall buildings? Why didn't they come up with way better schools or incredible symphonies? What is it about the Olympics that causes giant skyscrapers to be built?
Olympics, like most So there's, the Olympics you can put in the class of sports stadiums and convention centers and these kind of major public facilities. They're usually pretty disappointing in economic development effects. The one where actually they were not disappointing economically was actually Barcelona. They kind of paid for themselves, but they did unleash a luxury building boom there. Almost everywhere else, either they cost a lot more than is predicted. That's like home remodeling, right? You know, it's the 2-3 rule, right? Twice the money and 3 times the time. So the Olympics are kind of like that too. But in addition, you're right. We don't have very many experiences of cities that have written into the Olympics anything like serious affordability provisions. Right? So, and that's usually because of the way they're structured as business deals.
So we have like 3 more minutes. Louis has a question. I haven't seen you.
I'm glad you don't have eyes in the back of your head. You're better looking this way. I have a client that moved to Indianapolis, and her son was having trouble finding a place there, so got a 9,000 square foot lot, a 2,500 square foot home, and it's all for $150,000. And so,
are you selling
That's
real
maybe
estate?
you here.
no, I'm saying that in the same way that there's going to be a natural flux in this country that is going to have growth, and then a new city will be born, and then LA, maybe it'll take some of the pressure off. Maybe, you know, it's the same kind of a thing where something's got to give, and it's going to give with migration out. But the idea of the city as an evolving entity where, I mean, we want more eclectic things in Santa Monica, with more varieties of restaurants. And now if you go down on 3rd Street or 4th Street, you can find really cool places to go hang out, you know, on 2nd Street. And that has a lot of draw for the as you say, the technologically evolved and the need to communicate with each other. So there are no easy answers. And I drove back from the airport today going 35, 40 miles an hour coming north on Centinela. Coming south, it was about 1 or 2 miles an hour. So the working.
So Louis, do you have a question?
But is there a solution? Is there really, I mean, all these people pontificating and then want to stuff 10 units next to a guy that finally got to afford to be able to live in.
He's against that.
I mean, leave residential neighborhoods alone.
We have another question here, and that all right, so Thane, and then you, but they have to be a quick question because the librarian will get mad at us.
Okay, quick question, Mike. Okay, I'm wondering if there's an elevator speech. I mean, the elevator speech for their side is more supply, prices go down, supply and demand.
Right.
What is the elevator speech? And this seems like a very complex problem. Every time you try to describe it, it seems to me it just goes out further and further. And you did a very good job of doing that, making it understandable. But is there a very succinct kind of response to somebody who has the argument for it?
Okay, I mean, you know, as an academic, I don't like doing that because but I do think there's a core argument, and that is more supply through zoning shock therapy leads to a boom in luxury construction without trickle down.
Okay, question?
That's good.
So, under existing California law, if I were to build a new apartment building, it would be at market rate. And there's now pending legislation that proposes to rent control after 10 years after construction. Is there any academic research that indicates whether that would discourage people from building more apartment houses?
There is a big academic literature on rent control. Yes, so I think it has a lot of different findings, and I'm not a total expert on it. There is probably a discouragement effect in terms of building housing. Yeah, so that if depending on how the rent control is brought onto line, yes, there is some evidence that it discourages certain projects. The other thing is that rent control, it encourages people to stay where they are. So that's good for the renters and the communities, but it might also have a collateral effect of sort of keeping other people from accessing the neighborhoods where they might be better located. So there was one recent study that said that. But rent control is a super complex subject in and of its own right, yeah.
So, we're going to have to wrap, but, I just
Thank
really.
you so much.
Hold on 1 second.
Oh, but as you're going out, go ahead and grab one of our sheets. We use divisive language about the evil twin of SB 50. It's called SB 330.
Yeah.
And if you'll email us in the bottom email on the sheet, we're going to do a Thursday night virtual lobbying teleconference. We're going to have everybody call in. We're going to tell you exactly who to call and exactly who to write to oppose SB 330. So on Thursday night, if you just email us at the bottom of the sheet, we'll invite you to Thursday night, just a teleconference. You call in, it's really easy and it's fun.
Because the bill's going through because the bill's in the assembly now. It passed the Senate.
Education writer for LA.